Hear me, you're going to be hearing the voices of so many. The state of Ohio is facing a public health crisis with responses that have for decades produced little to no resolution. This public health crisis is childhood trauma. While the state of Ohio has invested billions of dollars in infrastructure around health care costs associated with trauma care, we continue to see an increase in adverse life experience and shortened life expectancy, along with an increase in juvenile detention and adult prison population, both of which largely attributed to childhood traumatic events. Research and increased collect data continues to demand the need for a significant call to action regarding childhood trauma. Ohio has shown its awareness of trauma as a salient issue that requires a critical response. To date, the awareness and investment by the state has yet to decrease the number of cases associated with trauma year after year. The private sector and private nonprofit organizations have been trying to merge state funding and private funding to provide a solution. The state's investment in and the approach to both the cost and care of trauma has been noble. However, root causes and conditions of childhood trauma persist. The great state of Ohio has a mere 5 childhood trauma centers all around private nonprofit agencies. In 2019, 28% of all children between 0 and 17 had experienced some type of childhood trauma. With 2.7 million children in the state of Ohio, this means 729,000 children in 2019 had experienced one or multiple forms of childhood trauma. Private trauma centers can serve at best 300 children a year, demonstrating a minimum access to significant long-term life-improving care. It is estimated that abuse and neglect cost Americans $80 billion in the direct cost of hospitalization, law enforcement and child welfare, and indirect costs of special education, juvenile and adult criminal justice, adult homelessness, and lost work productivity. One study has predicted that the cost of violence and abuse on the healthcare system range between $333 billion and $750 billion annually. Children who have suffered from multiple adverse childhood experiences or victimization are at a highest risk for losing fundamental capacities they need to develop normally and become successful learners and productive adults. I'm going to cut my testimony there short because I want to kind of give a more personal perspective. So, I was conceived by rape. I survived 2 abortion attempts because my mom didn't have the money. She, was too poor to go to a facility to actually do an abortion. So she tried in-home abortion attempts. I was adopted at the age of 5 to a man that beat me, starting at the first day of adoption until my skin broke, until I bled at 5 years old. This abuse went on until I finally decided to run away, and I went into the lighthouse first before they put me into the first home they placed me in. And I ran away from there looking for my biological father because I thought that this could be my opportunity to get saved, to a new life, right? Well, my father was a drug addict. He was addicted to crack and heroin. So at the age of 12, I was sleeping in abandoned houses. We would kick in doors of abandoned houses and sleep on the floors. And at nights, I would roll carpet up to roll around me to try to keep warm. So this was my life. My life was filled with some of the worst trauma that you can imagine, right? I didn't ask for any of this. But guess what came along with it? The need for survival. So I had to develop these survival skills. I had no one. I've been alone since I was a child, learning to raise myself, learning to protect myself. So I didn't learn, family values, love, protection, safety. None of those qualities were afforded to me, right? So now I've grown into this adult male that suffer from nightmares. I have nightmares more days out the week than not of me being attacked. Sometimes it's monsters, sometimes it's people. But the sad part about it is those nightmares now have turned into daymares because in my regular daily function, thoughts just I feel like I'm being attacked on all sides. I feel unsafe. So this is my daily life. As I said, there's so many children right now that suffer from childhood trauma issues at no fault of their own. So we have to take this to a policy level, because what we've been doing, it hasn't been enough. This bill is historical. To declare a state of emergency on childhood trauma would start a precedent that this country has never seen before. And Ohio taking the lead on it would be a really good look. Because we can't continue just criminalizing, children that make these choices with these brains that are wired for survival. They don't even understand how they're functioning. But we're quick to label it, criminals, bad behavior, when nobody's looking at what happened. So, Chairman Lips, Vice Chair Holmes, I'm asking for Ohio to become the first state to declare a state of emergency on childhood trauma, because I can't be silent anymore, and I won't allow the world to ignore that childhood trauma is an epidemic, and it's something that we have to address now. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Hummons. Questions, committee? Vice Chair Holmes.
Mr. Hummons, thank you so much for that testimony and your courage and your communication and your determination to come here and all of us hearing what you said. I also want to give full credit to Representative Weston Upchurch for identifying our true root cause of so many issues that we deal with in this state, and you articulated it perfectly. The trauma that we get when we're young is probably more impactful than what we get as we old. And so when we endure traumatic events when we're older, we're already almost overwhelmed, and that's what carries us over. My experience in the Marine Corps, 30 years, and I dealt with multiple young men and women dealing with traumatic stress. And we called it post-traumatic, but it was actually things, most of them that had problems, it was because of things that happened to them when they were younger. So when things were critical overseas, it overwhelmed them. Right. What I wanted to ask you, the question I wanted to ask you is, the child trauma centers, have you seen successful protocols and things that are done at those centers? What could we do as a state? What are the winning solutions that you would see at a trauma center?
One of the things that I feel is missing at a lot of the trauma centers is really understanding cultural trauma. So what I mean by that is, so African Americans and African American children, our trauma is very unique, right? So when you start to really understand, you can't label it all in the same box. When I'm speaking around the country at different colleges, I always give this description. So, and here, I guess you would use the neighborhood Dublin. In Cincinnati, we have a suburb called Indian Hill, right? So little Billy, he's a young white male. He grows up in this beautiful home, two-family, nourishing family, goes to one of the best schools in the city. So little Billy, when he graduates, he decides he wants to go serve his country, and they may send him to Afghanistan for a couple of years, and he may not really even see any real combat. But when he comes home and goes, to visit his family, let's say on Thanksgiving, and, mom's noticing that he's acting a little strange. So the first thing they say is, we're going to take little Billy to see our therapist, our family therapist, next week after the holiday. So they take little Billy to go see this therapist, and, he asks him questions, and he, finds out that he went overseas for a little while. The first diagnosis, and I always let the audience answer this when I speak around the country on this, what's the first diagnosis this therapist wants to give little Billy? It's PTSD. And it may be a justifiable diagnosis. But yet, we have African-American children, poor whites, Appalachian children that literally are in positions where they're being failed by Child Protective Services, Job and Family Service, our juvenile courts. They're not placed in safe spaces. And there's so many other safe spaces they can be placed in. But, so we had the guy up in Cleveland, I don't know if you guys remember, about 2 years ago, where, his child's mother and her boyfriend killed his daughter. And this was a man that tried to file for custody for his daughter, and they wouldn't give it to him because he had a past criminal record. But yet, in today's world, this man has a great job, and he's came a long way since his past. But you decided to leave this child in the home where a mother has clear mental health issues, her boyfriend, and he was a violent criminal, and then they killed the child. Other situations where, a lot of African-American children that grow up in poverty, they grow up in these violent, drug-infested, really toxic environments when there's so many other safe spaces that they can be placed in, but they get ignored because, and Ohio is really a big state about, keeping the kid with the mom. And that's not always a safe space. So you have these kids that grow up in these really violent, drug-infested, toxic environments that we create. We create these environments. We create, the atmosphere these kids live in, and then we criminalize them when the behavior comes out and it reflects the exact behavior. It's like a petri dish. You know what I'm saying? So these kids, man, are growing up in these petri dishes that are like perfectly conducive for developing trauma, and then we'll just criminalize it and say, okay, we're not going to deal with the trauma piece, but we will, give you a number and we're going to give you some time. So, like I said, for me, one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of the trauma centers that we do have is trauma is not recognized, culturally. And then a lot of children are automatically diagnosed with AD and ADHD, and it's a misdiagnosis a lot of the times. That needs to be more, looked into carefully. So I mean, there's a lot of different things that needs to really be looked at. When you talk about mental health, you can't talk mental health without talking nutrition. But yet, in African-American communities and in the poor communities, we have the what we call like the goodwill of grocery shopping. Can't think of the name of the grocery. Yeah, Save-A-Lots. But we have to go out into the suburbs to go to a fresh market. A lot of us don't even understand how nutrition affects us, with mental health because that education is not out there, right? So we don't understand what foods are toxic that can, continually, develops these negative patterns in our body because trauma lives in our body as well. It's not just cognitive. So this education needs to be placed out there the same way. When I'm here in Columbus and I see the commercials about opioids, I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't even know what an opioid was. My father was a crackhead and a heroin addict. So those were the terms that we grew up with, as in my neighborhoods, right? So when I see these commercials and I, see the kids that they use for these commercials and how informative it is, I'm like, wow, okay, I didn't know that. We need to do the same thing with childhood trauma.
Committee, additional questions? Representative Upchurch.
Thank you, Chairman. Ronald, thank you for coming before the committee today. I appreciate your presentation as well as your courage to bring this issue to light. When you came to my office, we had a very deep conversation, and we hit it off instantly because, you and I are from similar neighborhoods, right, and have experienced similar things, and I think that we are both an example that you can overcome the odds, and I think this resolution is the first step in that right direction. You mentioned, in suburban areas that we tend to see this childhood trauma too. It's not just in urban areas that I represent. And if you could help me, because a lot of my colleagues don't represent urban areas, but that does not mean that they don't care. I know that my colleagues do care about children all across Ohio. Can you talk about the same trauma that impacts children, not just in urban areas or communities of color, but in rural areas and suburban areas that some of my colleagues may represent?
Yeah, definitely. So the thing is, childhood trauma creates the blueprint for the rest of our lives. Everyone in this room right now. Like, I don't know any of y'all's stories, But childhood trauma, it literally will impact the rest of our adult lives. So whether you're from the suburbs and, father not in your life, abuse, whatever the situation, you can come from the most wealthiest family. Childhood trauma impacts our lives no matter what demographic we come from. And it creates the blueprint for what the rest of our life is going to look like. And that's kind of the short answer. And that's how serious this thing really is. That's why I said this is a real epidemic here. Because it doesn't matter what your background is. Childhood, so this is one of the things I always tell people, no matter where you're from, look at some of the chaos. And chaos may be divorce, may be, relationship problems, whatever it may be. I guarantee you that it can be rooted somewhere in your childhood, in childhood trauma. So it's like if we're not dealing with this issue, then we're not dealing with everyday life. Is that kind of...
That'll do, brother. That'll do.
Okay.
Representative Carruthers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Upchurch. I believe actually that you and Representative West have an excellent resolution here, and I think it is much more broad spectrum than and you have certainly intimated that it is much more broad spectrum. You can come from a very wealthy family and have a terrible life. Your parents could fight all the time. You could come from an alcoholic background. You don't know. And they certainly have better drugs. So I think you have to look at this on a broader. I think we always tend to look at the urban, but which is cyclic. You're absolutely right. I'm so proud and impressed that you did not fall into those same patterns. It's wonderful, but you could have, and it's a tribute to you that you have not. So thank you for coming here today.
Thank you.
Representatives, additional questions? Mr. Hummons, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Chairman Lips. Okay.
The next witness, we will back up and ask for Amy Samuelson. Do we know if she's here? Is she here? Great. Committee, we understand, please sign everything before you leave, but we understand you have a 12 o'clock meeting and that most of you have been called away at this time. So we understand that totally. We do not have permission to run the committee later today because the room is booked, so we have no choice but to continue with the hearing and take care of these last two bills. So please, we understand if you have additional obligations. Ms. Samuelson, thank you very much for your patience and for waiting and for coming back and presenting to committee.
Thank you, and I wanted to say thank you for hearing me last time. My apologies I felt very emotional because I think I experienced myself an episode of PTSD while I was sitting here listening last time about the suicide awareness bill that was being presented. My fiance committed suicide on August 16th of this year. I myself have suffered from what I called depression and anxiety since about the age of 8. We talk about the urban folks, the folks that, we would think would have trauma. But people like myself, I grew up like east side of Columbus, middle class. I graduated like third in my class, passed my CPA exam the first time. Very, very successful in corporate America. Married to a Marine, big Republican for a while. I don't know about that anymore though. And I guess my whole life I went around feeling apathetic, tense, kind of sad, kind of like nothing really was fun. I was really nervous about raising my kids, nervous about this, very outwardly focused. I didn't know until a couple years ago that I had ADHD, and now I don't even know if I have ADHD or if it's trauma. My boyfriend who passed had I'm sorry, I can't think of the word, I'm sorry, but I had the opportunity just about a year ago to take a year off work. My boss said, Amy, you're not going to probably be happy where we put you. We know you have some issues. He's a really good friend of mine. He let me be laid off. So I deep dived like crazy like it was my full-time job to try to figure out what the heck was wrong with me. I went to a therapist a couple times a week, and she kept saying, I think this is trauma. And I'm like, no, I had a perfect, wonderful life. And I actually felt sad that I felt like I would beat myself up for even being depressed because I had such a good life. When I started to realize and look down into the 50 or so different traumatic events that happened, I'm like, whoa. Our system has failed me. It has failed my kids. It's failed my ex-husband who had PTSD from the military. If I look back on my childhood growing up in what was a decent neighborhood, one of the friends' parents was a Vietnam vet who beat their mother. Another one was an alcoholic. Another friend of mine had like 3 abortions. Another friend of mine's getting beat up every single day because he was Asian. It's like we're all experiencing it, whether it's, no matter what it is, we have someone we know who has experienced trauma. I was really, really surprised when I started reading up on it and learning how freaking simple it really is to fix. So, to me, number one, yes, we need survival. We can't just be surviving like what Ronald talked about. How can we have people feel safe? Well, the people that are providing support and services for them, if we can educate them and evolve. I think what happened is along the line, we became very focused on physical health, the body, treating symptoms, and then, oh, well, a symptom is they're a criminal and they're a drug addict and they're this and that. Let's put them in jail. Let's, give them this pill. We're not really treating, as we said, the root cause. And the root cause we'll find in very, very many cases is trauma. If we actually work on trauma, can you imagine? We could all have like a 20-hour work week because we could actually walk around feeling safe about what we're going to talk about, not getting jumped at, not getting yelled at, not having all the anger and the resentment and the sadness and the apathy and the fear, and like actually dive down, understand that root cause and help this generation coming up so that we can lessen the generational impact of the trauma that's being passed on generation after generation. This is not an issue from the last 400 years of Black America. This is an issue of human creation since birth of, how many wars have we been through? How many traumatic events, famines? Us in America are 108 or so countries, all represented here with all of our traumas. So, to me, I thought this is like a no-brainer. If we do a state of emergency on trauma, we can get people together to figure out what is actually working, make change. We don't necessarily have to spend a ton of money. We can change some of the programs we have now, and we can go to the private sector and say, hey, we want you all to raise the bar, and here's what we're looking for. So one of the things is really just to understand what your emotions are trying to tell you, what your body's trying to tell you, to teach little kids how to understand what that means, to have people feel safe as to who they can talk to, support, a way to actually get your information out of you, to get yourself feeling like you're seen, feeling like you're validated, getting the right nutrition. There's a lot of stuff that we've learned. It's not really all that difficult. It's just that I know all of you and all of us, we're the culmination of everything that came before us. And so I understand you inherited a system, and we all did. I think we can take a way up level at it and go, wow, we can change it. So but I think that's all I had to say. I could talk for hours on this, but. Right, exactly. So I'll let the next person come up.
Yeah. Ms. Samuelson, thank you. Committee questions? Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Our next witness will be Atticus Williams. If you could step forward, please. Thank you for being with us. I will remind you we continue to operate on a strict 5-minute limit today. Welcome to committee.
Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, thank you so much for having me. My name is Atticus Williams. I'm a fourth-year student at Ohio State, and I'm advocating on behalf of this bill. We currently have a very serious issue on our hands in the state of Ohio. Many of our children are suffering from the repercussions of childhood trauma. Some signs of this trauma can be eating disorders, developmental regression, aggressive behavior, sleeping disorders, cognitive issues, and mental health issues. and that list doesn't even cover half of the potential consequences of childhood trauma. The thought of any children or any child suffering through the consequences of childhood trauma is a horrifying thought, and is something that should make everyone in this room shudder. Think of any sort of child suffering from any single thing that I just listed. When a child undergoes childhood trauma, it radically changes how a child will look at any sort of situation, whether it be the most complex or even rudimentary. Trauma can cause the brain to freeze and go into a survival mode. Cognitive functions like thinking or coping mechanisms are forgotten or thrown out the window entirely. The child is only concerned with their survival, and this can severely impact their decision-making. As someone that has underwent a form of childhood trauma and has survived a suicide attempt, this bill strikes a personal chord with me. I suffered from severe depression for the better part of 6 years, from the ages of 11 to 17. And I decided I was going to take my life in 2016. Lucky for me, I had a strong support system and friends and family that checked up on me on that day, and they saved me. Afterwards, I was fortunate enough to have this continued strong support system and an environment that allowed for me to move past my trauma and work with my trauma. I was able to go to therapy. I was able to talk to my friends, family, colleagues, teachers, whoever was there for me. I had the financial resources to go to therapy. The problem is, many children in this state do not have those same advantages that I have. I grew up in a very wealthy environment. I come from suburban America. I heard earlier there's questions about how this issue can affect suburban America. I'm the embodiment of that. Children in this state don't have the adequate resources like I do. They don't have the necessary skills to cope with their trauma. They don't have the strong support systems that I do. And what we need to do as a state is try and build that strong support system for them. I am one of the very fortunate people that is lucky to have survived what I did, and it still affects me to this day. Depression does not just go away after, an event like that. It takes a long time, and it still burdens me to this day. I have to, some days there are days where I wake up and I can't look at myself in the mirror. But because of the skills that I was taught as a therapy and through my strong support system, I am able to get through those bad days. The state of emergency that we would declare on childhood trauma gives Ohio a unique position to be on the forefront of tackling this very serious issue. We cannot wait any longer. Our children cannot survive without us acting now. We need to show how much we care about our children in this state right now. This issue will not go away, and we must act immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, for the Health Committee, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for being with us today, Mr. Williams. Committee questions? Hearing none, thank you very much for sharing your story.
Thank you so much.
The next witness before Health Committee today will be Burr Robinson. If you could please step forward. Mr. Robinson, thank you for being with us today. Most of committee has been called away, as you can see, so we will provide your testimony to them. So everyone will be aware, but they've been called away to additional meetings because we ran over our 12 o'clock limit. Please proceed.
Thank you. My name is Burr Robinson, a resident of Cincinnati, where I am an active member in several agencies serving children in Cincinnati's low-income communities. In 1993, I retired from Procter & Gamble to form a not-for-profit agency called Jobs Plus Employment Network, whose mission is to find second-chance employment opportunities for men and women coming out of incarceration, off the streets, and out of rehab programs. In this work, I encountered many parents who, unbeknownst to them, were raising children in circumstances that led to trauma-induced negative behaviors. Their response was often counterproductive. Rather than dealing with the source of the trauma, often the children's trauma responses only increased. At the Lord's Gym Ministries, located in a large low-income community nearby downtown Cincinnati, we have learned to provide meals daily in our facility to families known to lack resources to provide for themselves on a regular basis. In our programs targeted to children, we can identify some of these families by the trauma experienced by the children. This program involves other private and public agencies working together. The Childhood Trauma Declaration should enable similar programs to be implemented in other communities across the state. I strongly support the resolution before your committee declaring a state of emergency on childhood trauma in Ohio. This resolution will raise awareness and lead to effective means to address trauma conditions through Ohio's social service and medical communities. Quite frankly, there is a lot of work to be done to establish the specific steps that need to be taken and the investments made. So the resolution is just the first step, of course, in what we expect to achieve. The need for action is clear, with over 700,000 Ohio children affected in 2019, an all-time high. Importantly, this declaration will lead to bringing together private and public resources to identify and launch effective courses of action that will properly diagnose and treat these children. So thank you for having me here today and listening to all of us on this very important issue.
Mr. Robinson, thank you for sharing your testimony with the committee. Committee, any questions? Hearing none, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
The next witness on HCR.25 will be Daria Ragland. If you'd please step forward. Hi, Ms. Ragland. Welcome to committee. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to be short and simple because I feel like everybody kind of covered everything that needed to be covered. My name is Daria Ragland. I am a childhood mental health and behavioral health specialist that works in the inner city schools. I'm actually on an e-board for Impact Community Actions, so I'm basically more community-based. This bill is really important, not only to me, but also the kids that are unable to have a voice for themselves. Working hands-on with kids with mental health and not being able to identify this policy, this bill will be so important and is so crucial for the community. Being able to have programs for inner city kids, therapy is an option, but also knowing that the demographic and families that we have, therapy is kind of not an option. So I just want to say this bill is really important to get passed because not only is it going to be doing a service for the kids of the younger generation to have a better future, it's just going to provide a different resource for them. And I feel like we owe the younger generation an opportunity at a better chance of life and just giving them a better opportunity. I don't want to disservice any of our kids anymore just for us kind of overlooking and overshadowing things that, doesn't affect us, but it affects people around us. So